A millionaire was heading home when he suddenly spotted C. The mogul slammed the brakes, bolted out of his vehicle, and sprinted toward the child. Thankfully, he managed to snatch her out of harm's way just in time. But what he uncovered at the hospital was the real shocker. So go ahead and settle in. Kick back and take in this tale. I genuinely hope it acts as the perfect lullaby to help you catch some quality shut-eye tonight. And with that, let's get started. The Colorado suburbs were shrouded in a faint haze that morning. The maples lining the road shivered slightly in the cool breeze, shedding golden leaves that scattered across the damp, streaky asphalt. A train's horn wailed in the distance, a low, mournful sound that echoed old memories. Ethan navigated his black Range Rover down the winding service road leading to the old rail line, a deserted stretch of track practically forgotten in the middle of the field. He sat ramrod straight, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight, his face etched with strain. Gray vest tie cinched snugly, everything about him was meticulous to the point of frigidity. In the rearview mirror, his gaze locked with his own reflection, a man of 48, who had weathered every loss, but had stopped believing in anything at all. The radio played softly in the car, the announcer mentioning the 10-year anniversary of the infamous train collision. Ethan quickly silenced it, his breath catching. He forced his focus back to the road ahead where the utility poles ran parallel to the tracks, stretching endlessly like an unbroken string of recollection. 5 years. That's how long it had been since his wife and daughter perished in that terrible locomotive impact. Since the night he stood by the embankment witnessing the train carriages engulfed in fire without being able to lift a finger. Since then, he'd worked non-stop trying to forget, but oblivion remained out of reach. Ethan turned onto a dirt access road that cut through a construction site. The tires crunched over the gravel. He checked his watch, 7:12 a.m. Need to double-check the foundation in the north section, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. But then, just as his vehicle approached the junction where the road met the tracks, a streak of something registered in his vision. At first, he dismissed it as a torn sack or a piece of fabric snagged on the rail. But as he drew nearer, his entire body tensed. It wasn't an inanimate object. It was a child. Ethan stomped on the brakes. The tires skidded on the wet ground with a screech that pierced the morning calm. He jumped out the cold wind, slapping his face, his heart hammering in his chest. In the middle of the 2 steel rails lay a tiny girl, curled up her hair, messy clothes soiled and feet bare. He yelled out, "Hey kid, wake up," no response. In the far distance, the sound of the oncoming train grew louder, its long horn blast vibrating through the air. The tracks began to tremble slightly. Ethan only allowed himself one final look, and then he bolted. He sprinted across the wet grass, stumbled, but kept moving. The train was rounding the bend less than 100 yards away. He stooped low, wrapped his arms around the girl, and pulled her off the tracks in the exact instant that the screech of metal roared right past his back. The turbulent air vortex violently kicked up, sending dirt and gravel flying. The sheer heat from the speeding locomotive made his ears ring. He tumbled onto the grassy shoulder, clutching the girl tightly in his arms. Sweat mixed with mist beaded on his forehead. The small body shivered in his embrace. "Can you hear me?" Silence, only her eyes barely open, fixed in a vacant stare. She struggled to breathe, her lips dry, her chest rising and falling weakly. Ethan shed his suit jacket and covered her with it. "Hold on, you're safe now. Someone is here." Her hand moved faintly as if grasping at thin air. Just then, the train's horn faded into the distance. A group of construction workers from the nearby site rushed over, asking frantic questions. Ethan didn't answer. He lifted the girl into his arms and headed back toward his vehicle. 10 minutes later, the emergency medical vehicle arrived. A nurse leaned down to examine her. 6 years old, weak heartbeat. Looks like old bruising on her wrists. Potential for ill treatment. Ethan listened to heavy feeling settling in his stomach. He looked around, no one was searching for her. It was just him and the girl in the chill wind. When the police arrived to question him, Ethan kept his answers brief. "I was on my way to the site and saw her lying there. No one else was around." A young officer bent down, checked the girl's pocket, and pulled out a crumpled, torn piece of paper, Lena. The nurse asked, Do you have any family members who can provide temporary care for her? Ethan didn't reply. He stood watching the child being placed on the stretcher, her matted hair, her small dirty face. That look in her eyes opened up a deep emotional wound within him, the memory of his own daughter who used to call him Daddy. He turned away. I was just passing by. But just as he prepared to walk back to his car, Lena's small hand reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. Mister, don't go. Her voice, raspy and weak, froze him in his tracks. He looked down, her small eyes frightened, trembling, yet utterly clinging. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Distant sounds dissolved. There was only him, the child, and the thread-like rain falling around them. He nodded gently, his voice thick. All right. I'm not going anywhere. The nurse looked up surprised. Are you sure we can take her to the temporary shelter? No need. I'll handle it. Ethan spoke curtly, then lifted Lena into his arms. She rested her head on his shoulder, her faint breath brushing his collar. The smell of smoke, earth, and mist blended, bringing back the memory of that fateful morning years ago. As he walked toward his vehicle, a police officer called out. Mr. Cole, we'll need your contact info. You're still the owner of Cole Industries, right? That's right. Send the paperwork to my Denver office. The car door shut the rain, drumming steadily on the roof. Ethan turned on the heat and looked at the girl lying on the passenger seat. Lena stirred slightly, her lips moving as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. He spoke softly. Rest now. You're secure. The Range Rover pulled away, slowly leaving the cold, damp rail area behind. Outside, another train rolled along the old line, its headlights cutting through the thin sheet of rain, reflecting a yellow glow on the child's face. Ethan squeezed the steering wheel gently. In the rearview mirror, Lena's eyes watched him, wide, exhausted, but alive. A memory flashed like a sharp edge, his daughter, brown hair, red jacket, running on the platform, turning back to smile. Daddy, I want to ride the train again. His breath hitched. He turned the radio dial to fill the silence. Breaking news this morning. A Denver millionaire performed a heroic act safeguarding a 6-year-old girl from the tracks in the city's outskirts. Ethan immediately shut off the radio. The silence in the car became dense. He looked at the road ahead where the weak light of dawn merged with the misty rain. I was just passing through, you know. No one answered. Lena had drifted off, her face remarkably peaceful. The distant train sounded a long wail, the metal shriek echoing through the valley. The Range Rover stopped before a tall iron gate opening onto a long stone driveway leading to the suburban Denver mansion. It was late afternoon, the sky a dense concrete gray, the wind whistling cold through the spindly birch trees. Ethan switched off the engine but didn't rush to get out. He sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight into the empty yard. We're here. Lena didn't respond. She rested her head against the window glass, her gaze lost on the moss-covered stone wall. When Ethan opened the door, a faint creaking sound echoed in the utterly silent space. She lightly hopped down, clutching the teddy bear the nurse had given her at the hospital. The house was vast, but eerily quiet. The entire interior was arranged with chilling orderliness. The living room displayed cold-toned paintings, and the polished wooden tables were completely dust-free. The kitchen was pristine, every cup lined up perfectly, a place showing no signs of life, no smell of food, no human warmth. Ethan flipped on the kitchen light. The pale yellow glow illuminated the cold stainless steel. Are you hungry? Maybe something quick before a wash-up? Lena nodded faintly, her eyes still taking in the kitchen. He rummaged through the fridge, grabbed a few ready-made meals and warmed them in the microwave. When pouring orange juice into a glass, his hand trembled slightly. The juice spilled over the rim, trailing a long streak down the counter. Ethan frowned quickly, wiping it up, but Lena was still watching. Her small gaze made him self-conscious, as if she could see him in a role he never imagined holding again, that of a father figure. They sat opposite each other, eating. The sound of spoons clicking against plates was strangely loud. Your name is Lena, right? The girl nodded, her voice small. I remember but others said that name wasn't on the paperwork. Paperwork doesn't tell the whole story, Ethan said, then suddenly realized he was trying to console her, just like he did with his own daughter years ago. He stopped looking up at the ceiling to swallow the emotion rising in his throat. When the meal ended, Lena put her spoon down, wiped her mouth with her sleeve, and stood up. Your room is upstairs on the second floor, next to mine. Staircase is on the left. Okay. She took slow steps, taking off her shoes before ascending the stairs. Ethan watched her. Her small figure vanished around the banister, leaving behind footsteps as light as rain tapping on the roof. Night fell, the rain pattering persistently. In his bedroom, Ethan sat by the window watching the city lights blur in the distance. The sound of a train echoed low and deep, as if dragging across his heart. He thought about the girl in the room next door and the feeling when she grabbed his jacket sleeve that morning. A small, frail hand, yet anchoring him with something stronger than reason trust. A faint sound drifted from the hallway. He stood up, walked out, and stopped before Lena's door. The nightlight glowed through the crack. Ethan gently pushed the door open, empty. The blanket was pulled onto the floor, the window slightly ajar. The train sound returned closer now. He looked around, then spotted Lena's small shadow huddled beneath the bed, curled up, trembling. Lena, what are you doing down there, I hear? The train. It's coming. Her voice was broken. Ethan knelt lightly, touching the mattress. It's okay. It's just a train passing by. No one is going to hurt you anymore. She was still shaking. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just sat there, leaning against the bed, waiting until the train sound eventually faded. As he was about to leave, Lena whispered, You heard it too, right? Yeah, I heard it. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Ethan opened the door to find a woman in a heavy coat holding a file folder. Mr. Ethan Cole. I'm Sienna Hart, the social worker handling the child's case. She was about 35, hair pulled back with clear, alert eyes. She stepped inside, surveying the house, her gaze pausing on the bare walls and the dining table set for only two. This place, there's no smell of food, no sound of conversation. Ethan replied, his voice low. There's no one to talk to either. Sienna quickly jotted notes, then looked up. You know, the law requires me to assess the suitability for temporary care. The girl needs stability. Stability. Nothing here is shaking. Sienna looked at him for a few seconds, then spoke frankly. This place isn't built for children, Mr. Cole. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. It's not built for adults either. They sat down at the dining table. Sienna spread the files, reading through the list. I need your signature here. For now, Lena will stay with you until a suitable foster family can be found. Ethan picked up the pen and signed without reading. How long do you plan to keep her? Until someone else steps up. While they talked, Lena sat on the porch holding a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. She drew faint dark lines forming the shape of a railroad track, then added a man pulling a small child. The wind blew, nearly snatching the paper away. Ethan walked onto the porch, standing behind her. What are you drawing? Lena flinched, covering the paper. No one believes me. Ethan paused, not asking for clarification. I believe you. The girl looked up, suspicion in her eyes. Why? Because I know what it's like to lose someone you trusted. Lena stared at him for a long moment, then lowered her head. I don't want them to find me. Here they won't. Late that afternoon, Sienna prepared to leave. She turned back to Ethan. She needs someone to listen to her, not just shelter. I'm not great at talking. Then start by being quietly present next to her. That night, the house remained quiet. Ethan sat alone in his study, opening the file Sienna had left behind. Inside were cold clinical lines of text: biological mother deceased due to overdose, stepfather missing, no reachable next of kin. He stopped at the photo of the girl, messy hair, scared, but tearless eyes. Just like the last time he saw his own daughter in the moment she lay on the stretcher years ago. Ethan closed the file and stepped into the hallway. Lena's door was slightly ajar. She was asleep, slumped in a chair, hugging her old teddy bear, her head resting against the wall. The light cast on her small, tired face. He walked over, intending to drape the blanket over her, but as his hand reached her hair, he froze, the warm feeling spreading to his fingertips, accompanied by a familiar dread, the fear of getting attached only to lose again. The afternoon rain poured down suddenly. Heavy drops slammed against the roof tiles, overflowing the eaves, dripping in thick streams. Inside, Ethan stood leaning by the window frame, his eyes fixed on the water-blurred road. Just then, his phone rang. The screen displayed Sienna Hart. He answered, his voice steady. "What is it, Ms. Hart?" "Something came up, and you should probably brace yourself. 2 individuals claiming to be Lena's legal guardians have shown up. They have paperwork and demanded an immediate meeting." Ethan turned, glancing toward the living room where the girl was sitting and drawing. The pale yellow desk lamp illuminated her small, focused face. "Who are they?" "A woman named Marta Cruz, and the man with her is Diego Vega. Old records show they were once temporary caregivers for Lena in New Mexico. That certificate expired 2 years ago, but they insist the child belongs to them." "What do they want?" "I think you know the answer. Money." A brief silence followed. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was like a frantic drumbeat. "Fine. Arrange for them to come over. I want to look them in the eye before making any decisions. 3 o'clock in the afternoon." The rain still hadn't stopped. Sienna drove up with the 2 visitors. Ethan opened the door, arms crossed, waiting. From the very first moment, he felt the atmosphere in the house shift. Marta walked in first, around 35, in a bright red dress, leather jacket, and large necklace. The scent of strong perfume filled the air. Following her was Diego, thin, slicked-back hair, with narrow eyes and a sharp, calculating gaze. "Oh my God, my precious Lena!" Marta cried out, rushing toward her. Lena stood by the stairs, stopping short. She didn't speak or smile, just clutched the teddy bear tightly. When Marta leaned down to hug her, Lena recoiled, backing up, taking a step onto the stair, her eyes wide with panic. Sienna intervened gently. "Ms. Cruz, please give her some space. Let's sit down and talk first." Marta forced a smile, smoothed her hair, and sat on the sofa. Diego remained silent, just glancing around the room the way someone might size up a piece of property. Ethan placed glasses of water in front of them. "You claim to be the guardians." Marta pulled a crumpled stack of papers from her purse and extended them. "Here, copies of the temporary care certificate from New Mexico. We raised the child since she was small, until she was snatched away. I just want to bring her back." Ethan quickly scanned the documents. The stamp was faded, and the issue date was 2 years past the expiration. "These papers are no longer valid." Diego chuckled softly, crossing his arms. "Everything has value if you know the right price to pay." The air in the room thickened. Sienna looked at Ethan, ready to speak, but he had already stood up, his voice firm. "The meeting is over." Marta's attitude immediately changed, tears streaming through her heavy makeup. "Mr. Cole, please. We are poor. I'm sick. I can't afford medicine. The girl is all I have." Ethan looked down at the papers on the table, then at her. "If you truly considered her everything, you wouldn't have left her alone on a railroad track." Marta choked back a sob, speechless. Diego gritted his teeth, his gaze filled with hostility. Sienna stepped forward, her voice calm but decisive. "Ms. Cruz, Mr. Vega, I advise you both to leave. This case is under investigation. If there is any attempt at intimidation, we will contact law enforcement." Diego stood up slowly, bowing his head. "Of course, we don't want to cause trouble. But Mr. Cole, believe me, this isn't over." As they left, the click of Marta's heels echoed on the stone floor, interspersed with the sound of the rain. Ethan closed the door, turning to see Lena standing at the foot of the stairs. She was gripping the teddy bear, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They're going to take me away," she sobbed. "No one is taking you away if you don't want to go." Ethan knelt down, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." The girl nodded, her tears falling onto his hand. That evening, the fire in the hearth crackled, casting a red glow on the gray walls. Ethan sat in his chair, reading an online newspaper on his iPad. A large headline scrolled across the screen: "Denver millionaire keeping girl to Polish his image." The comments below were flooded with suspicion, blame, and even insults. Ethan slammed the paper onto the table, breathing heavily. In the corner of the room, Lena sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the dark night. "Mister, what are people saying?" Ethan tried to smile. Just strangers talk. Don't pay attention. But if everyone believes them, then what? When people don't know the truth, they believe what makes them feel better. The girl was silent then, nestled into the chair, hugging her bear tight. Not far away in a damp parking lot near downtown Denver, Diego leaned against an old car holding an unlit cigarette. Rain fell through the streetlights, dissolving the smoke. Marta sat inside the car, wiping tears with a tissue. "He won't give in," she said, her voice shaky. "He will. Guys like him fear losing their reputation more than losing money. We just need to push a little harder." Diego picked up his phone and made a call. "Got anything hot?" "Good. Put it all over the net. Headline, hero or opportunist." He hung up, a cold smile on his face. The next morning, Ethan went to his car. The tire was flat, the rubber tread ripped open. He checked the security cameras. The screen was black, no signal. A piece of broken glass lay near the gate corner. Sienna came by that day to review the footage. "Someone clearly tampered with this. You should report it to the police." Ethan stood with his arms crossed, his eyes cold. "If they want money, they won't get it. What if they intend to hurt Lena?" Ethan paused, then replied softly, "I won't stand for that." Night. Rain fell again. Lena was asleep, her breathing steady in the small room. Ethan sat in the hallway, lights off, only the faint glow from the hearth illuminating the wall. The clock ticked. He looked at the girl's door. That unsettling feeling crept in, as if someone was watching. The morning was steeped in fog so thick that the fence outside the gate was just a faint shadow in the white mist. Ethan stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee, his eyes still glued to the view outside. The black car was parked on the side of the road across the street, engine off, doors closed, nobody inside. It had been there since before dawn. He stared for a long moment, then pulled the blinds shut, taking a deep breath, trying to slow his heart. Behind him, Lena sat at the dining table, slightly hunched, dark circles under her eyes. She stirred her bowl of cereal, not eating, just staring intently at the swirling milk. "Didn't sleep well?" Ethan asked. Lena shook her head faintly. "I keep hearing the train. It's right by my ear." Ethan didn't speak, just sat down opposite her. He poured more orange juice and placed the glass in front of her. "Drink a little." "Are you going to work?" "No, I'll stay here." That answer made the girl look up. In that brief glance, there was a flicker of relief, which then faded. The doorbell rang. Sienna walked in holding a folder of documents. "Good morning. I brought Lena's enrollment papers. If you want her to start next week, you need to sign today." Ethan looked up. "School now." Sienna placed the papers on the table, looking around the quiet house. She can't stay confined within these four walls forever. If you want her to return to normal, you have to let her face the world outside. Lena sat still, looking down at her hands. Ethan nodded faintly, his expression still heavy. "All right." Millbrook Elementary School was located on the edge of town, an old, pale yellow building with a patchy lawn. On her first day, Lena gripped her backpack straps tightly, her eyes fixed on her shoes. "You'll be okay?" Ethan asked softly. "I think so. I'll wait in the car." She nodded, then walked away. Inside the classroom, the students' noise was like a crashing wave. One boy teased loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Hey, that's the girl from TV." Lena froze. All eyes turned toward her. She just stared, showing no reaction. The teacher quickly intervened. No personal talk during class time. The class fell quiet, but the curious stares lingered. Lena lowered her head, writing her name in the corner of her notebook with shaky handwriting. At lunchtime, Ethan sat in his car outside the school gate. He held a paper coffee cup, his gaze sweeping the schoolyard. Amidst the rows of parents' cars, he spotted an unfamiliar man standing far away near the fence, a camera held up. The moment Ethan opened his door and stepped out, the man immediately turned away, ducking into a small alley. Ethan ran after him, but when he reached the spot, there was only a patch of rainwater and a smoldering cigarette butt. Evening. The house returned to its silence. Ethan sat reviewing the security camera footage, scrolling through each frame until he stopped at a black space. The memory card had been removed. No data remained from yesterday. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his finger lightly on the desk. Each tap merged with the sound of rain outside the window. They ate dinner in silence that evening. Lena cut small pieces of cake, occasionally stealing a glance at him. Finally she spoke. "Do you trust anyone?" Ethan looked up. "Not many." "Then why do you trust me?" He put his knife down and looked straight at the girl. "Because you have no reason to pretend." Lena looked at him for a long time, then lowered her head. Tears fell onto her cake slice, but she didn't wipe them away. When Sienna arrived, the air was thick. She sat down, her gaze shifting between Ethan and Lena. "I see she's withdrawing. You should consider having her see a trauma specialist," Ethan replied curtly. "She's been questioned enough. I don't want anyone digging around in her head anymore." Sienna didn't change her tone. "It's not about digging. It's about helping her open up." He didn't reply. Sienna sighed, standing up. "I won't force it, but if you keep maintaining this silence, you'll forfeit the chance to heal yourself too." She left. The door closed, leaving a heavy void. Night. Wind whistled through the hallway. Ethan sat in his study, the desk lamp illuminating his tired face. He closed his eyes, and in his dream he saw his daughter, white dress, radiant smile running on the tracks. The train approached the light blindingly bright, and he screamed, but his body wouldn't move. The girl turned her head, her mouth calling out "Daddy," before vanishing into a cloud of white smoke. Ethan jolted awake, gasping for air. Cold sweat soaked his shirt. He looked toward the door. Lena was standing there in the darkness. "I dreamt about the train, too." Her voice was faint as a breath of wind. He walked over, speaking softly. "It's okay. Just a dream." But before he could say more, the sound of an engine roared outside the gate. Both of them jumped. Ethan ran to the living room, pulling the curtains aside. The black car was slowly reversing its headlights, sweeping across the driveway before disappearing into the fog. On the wet ground, something reflected the light. He opened the door and stepped out. A small piece of paper had slid under the gate, soaked, its edges ripped. Ethan picked it up and opened it, scribbled ink-smudged writing, "Give back what doesn't belong to you." The rumor storm hit faster than the winter wind sweeping across Denver. On the front page of a major online newspaper, a headline screamed in bold black font, "Millionaire Ethan Cole, hero or manipulator." The photo of Ethan holding Lena by the tracks, the fierce light from the ambulance headlights in the background, was enhanced and distorted, making his face look grim. Right below the article suggested he illegally adopted the child, staged the event for public sympathy, and capitalized on a humanitarian image to boost his reputation. At Cole Industries headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Employees avoided eye contact when he walked past. In the conference room, several partners were waiting. Their faces were pale, as if confronting a contagious disease. One person spoke first. His voice hesitant. "We think we should temporarily withdraw from the community housing project. The media scrutiny is too intense, and it will affect all of our images." Ethan didn't answer. He simply nodded slightly, gazing out the window. The gray sky cast a thick layer of haze over the city. In the reflection of the glass, he saw his own face, a face already familiar with loss, but one that hadn't learned how to avoid being wounded. When the meeting ended, Sienna arrived. She placed a stack of printed articles on the table, her voice low but firm. "You have to speak out. If you stay silent, they will assume you are guilty." Ethan didn't look at her, only spoke softly. "They don't want the truth, Sienna. They just want a dramatic enough story to read with their morning coffee." Sienna was silent. She looked around the room where everything was so perfectly organized it felt emotionless. You can't protect this child with silence forever. The door closed behind her. In a small cafe downtown, Diego sat opposite a freelance reporter. He wore a black jacket, twirling an unlit cigarette. "What do you want from me?" the reporter asked, glancing around warily. "A story that sells." Diego gave a cold smile, pushing a USB drive across the table. Pictures, videos, a few minor details, everything necessary to make a man look like a liar. "Do rich people ever really do anything good?" he added, contempt in his voice. "Just write this. He rescued her for attention, not to help." The sound of the coffee grinder at the counter drowned out the last few sentences, but Diego's smile remained visible. 2 days later, the morning at Ethan's residence was no longer peaceful. A group of people gathered outside the gate holding signs with messages, "Don't use children as tools for reputation building. Return the girl to her real family." Their shouts mingled with the wind. Someone threw flyers over the fence, scattering across the lawn. Ethan stood motionless behind the glass door, his face as cold as the wall behind him. Upstairs, Lena hid in her room, pressed against the wall, her hands covering her ears. The shouts outside merged with the distant train whistle, making everything feel like a return to the old nightmare. Sienna sought out Marta that same afternoon. The small diner where Marta worked was near the highway, its walls stained and plastic chairs scratched. Marta sat at the last table, staring at a glass of cold water. "Diego is spreading fake news, isn't he?" Sienna asked directly. Marta flinched, her lips trembling. "I don't know. I just needed to survive. He promised to split the money with me when it was over." She avoided eye contact, her hands shaking slightly beneath the table. "You know what you're doing is wrong." "I do. But right or wrong won't help me pay the rent." Sienna remained silent. She looked at the woman before her, tired, defeated, yet clinging to the last few coins of her conscience. Late afternoon in the quiet house, Ethan went upstairs and found Lena packing her belongings. Her small backpack was already full. "Where are you planning to go?" The girl didn't turn around. "If I stay here, you'll be in trouble." Ethan walked over, his voice slow. "No one is making you leave." She stopped packing, looking up, her eyes lost. "People are saying I'm just a burden." "People will say anything," he replied. "All that matters is that you know who you are." Lena shook her head, tears falling. "I don't know who I am." Ethan said no more. He just bent down, gently pulling the backpack from her hands, placing it back on the bed. That evening, Sienna returned. Her face was grave. "I just got word from the Department of Social Services. They are reviewing the temporary guardianship. They might move the girl to the center." Ethan looked up at the old photo of his daughter on the wall, the picture faded, the wooden frame lightly scratched. His gaze lingered for a long time. Without needing to say more, Sienna understood he wouldn't give up. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Diego and Marta sat in their old car parked by an empty lot. The light from a cell phone screen illuminated their faces. "He hasn't caved yet," Diego said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Stop it, Diego, just stop." He let out a dry laugh. "Once people start questioning, the truth doesn't matter anymore. Just one more push." Marta remained silent, looking out. The night rain began to pour down. At home, Lena sat by the window, a white sheet of paper spread out in front of her. She used a pencil to draw the shape of a railroad track, but stopped halfway, the pencil snapping in two. Ethan walked past, saw it, and asked softly, "Do you want to connect it?" Lena looked up, her voice as faint as a breath. "If there's someone waiting on the other side." The statement froze him. In that instant, he saw himself in those eyes, someone who had waited for someone on the other side of loss and who had never crossed over. Late night. Heavy rain. Ethan was about to close the window when headlights swept across the front yard. An engine roared, then cut out. He walked to the door and opened the gate. In the rain, something was dangling between the iron bars. A photograph. Ethan took it down. It was a picture of him and Lena at the hospital, but it had been cut in half. His section was ripped to shreds while Lena's half was marked with red ink. The gossip cyclone hit like a poison wind, sweeping away everything Ethan had tried to preserve over the years. His name plastered every major Denver news outlet, each one finding a way to make the headline more shocking: hero or exploiter Millionaire Cole and the shady adoption case. How much does kindness cost? The photo of him holding Lena on the tracks. The harsh light from the train headlights, exaggerated, was zoomed in on and commented on by thousands of skeptical voices. People dissected every detail: the way he looked at the girl, his tired smile, even his sheltering hands. They argued it was a media pose. At Cole Industries headquarters, employees whispered in the corridors, their eyes darting away when he passed. The phone rang constantly: partners, shareholders, media. In an emergency meeting, Ethan sat still, back straight, watching the lights reflect on the table surface. "We need to clarify everything," one person said urgently. The company can't withstand any more public relations crises. Ethan only nodded slightly, his eyes fixed on his tightly clasped hands. In that moment, he realized the only thing tethering him here wasn't his work, but the promise he had made to the girl in that small house. That afternoon, 2 police officers arrived. The rain was still drizzling. They stood formally at the door carrying a subpoena for questioning. Lena clung behind the doorframe teddy bear in hand. Her large eyes watched the adult speaking in dry official tones. "We need to take Mr. Cole's statement regarding the non-procedural adoption," the officer said. "Little Lena will remain here temporarily, but all actions are under government supervision." Ethan remained silent, nodding. A week later, attorney Roberto Duarte arrived. He was from the Department of Family and Social Services, square face, black suit, his voice measured and firm. Ethan's office was filled with dim light. In the cold room, the sound of rain hitting the window mixed with the rustle of papers as Duarte opened the file. "Mr. Cole, I need evidence that you are not exploiting the girl for personal gain." Ethan answered slowly, each word heavy. "I'm not exploiting anything. I merely rescued a child whom others had abandoned." Duarte closed the file, pushing it slightly toward him. "Rescuing doesn't mean keeping. The law isn't based on kindness, it's based on paperwork." The statement felt like a cold knife slicing through the deepest part of Ethan's heart. He knew he was about to lose more than just a child, perhaps the last fragile bit of belief he had left in people. At the social services office, Sienna was arguing fiercely with her superior. Her voice was strained, unlike her usual composure. "If we take the child now, she will break. He is the only person she still trusts." The director looked at her over his glasses. "But procedure is procedure. We can't make exceptions for emotion." Sienna was silent. She knew he was right, but she also knew there were things that couldn't be measured by paperwork. Outside Ethan's gate, groups of strangers gathered. They used white chalk to write on the wall, "Child Thief." A rock flew over the fence, shattering on the front steps. Inside, Lena sat hugging her teddy bear, her small body trembling. Ethan stood at the window, his eyes focused outward. But there was no anger, only emptiness. He no longer tried to explain. Some storms don't require fighting. You just need to stand firm until they pass. Elsewhere, Marta turned on the TV in her old rental room. Ethan's image appeared on the screen, edited amidst harsh text. She covered her mouth, tears welling up. "He doesn't deserve this," she whispered. Diego, sitting by the window, gave a cold laugh, puffing on his cigarette. "See who's winning now." Marta looked at him, terrified. "What are you doing?" "Call it balancing the scales. He has the money, I have the story. Everyone's making a living, Marta." She turned away, her heart heavy. For the first time, she felt afraid of the man she had shared cheap meals with in the corner of the market. Night, heavy rain. In the quiet house, the fire in the hearth flickered its orange light, scanning the cracked wall. Ethan sat alone, a pile of company documents before him. He picked up one sheet, stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half. Then another sheet. Paper flew across the floor, falling like dirty snow. "I spent my whole life protecting what wasn't worth it." His voice was faint, unsure who he was talking to. A small hand touched his shoulder. Lena stood there, hair loose, her eyes still slightly swollen. "I don't need you to rescue me. I just need you to stay." The statement made Ethan look up. The firelight caught his eyes, reflecting a face that looked older, but revitalized. For the first time in years, he truly smiled. A shaky smile, but genuine. A few days later, Sienna brought news a hearing would be held. She looked around the wrecked house, the torn papers, the broken window, the faint chalk writing still visible outside. "Are you ready for the final bout?" Ethan looked up. "This time I am." The answer was brief, but weighted like an oath. The Denver sky that morning was covered in a leaden sheet. There was no sunlight, just a thick, heavy layer of clouds, so low it felt like they might touch the courthouse roof. In the small changing room behind the main hallway, Ethan straightened his tie. The mirror reflected a thinner face than before, his eyes calm, but containing something deeper than exhaustion. Behind him, Lena sat on a chair, her legs swinging, clutching her teddy bear tight. The pale blue dress Sienna had chosen made her figure appear even smaller amidst the steel and rules of the place. Ethan leaned down and spoke softly. "It's okay. No matter what happens, you just need to look at me." Lena nodded, her mouth silent, but her eyes radiating absolute trust. Outside, the courthouse hallway buzzed with reporters. Cameras, microphones, and sharp questions pressed in. Sienna walked ahead, holding out her arms to shield the lenses. "Don't answer anything," she whispered. "They don't want the truth, Ethan. They just want a villain." Ethan didn't reply, gently ushering Lena inside, away from the barrage of flashbulbs. The courtroom was small, with a high ceiling and stark white light reflected off the heavily lacquered wooden benches. On the high bench, Judge Monroe, a middle-aged woman with neatly parted gray hair, sat upright. She looked down at the thick file before her, then glanced at Lena. Her expression momentarily softened, but remained serious. At the tables on either side, lawyers and prosecutors organized their papers. In the center, Ethan sat with Sienna. Before starting, he glanced at the girl, seeing her place the teddy bear on her lap, her hands gripping the edge of her skirt as if trying to maintain composure. The gavel struck the sound, brief but resonant. The Denver family court hearing is now in session. Roberto Duarte, the prosecutor, rose. His suit was immaculate, his tie diagonally striped, every movement precise. "Your Honor, we do not dispute Mr. Ethan Cole's courageous act in saving little Lena. But we question the subsequent intent when he unilaterally took custody without adhering to any established procedure." The room fell silent. Duarte continued, his voice steady but sharp. "A man of wealth and significant influence can inadvertently turn an impulsive act into a public spectacle. The law must protect the child, not the adult's feelings." Ethan sat still, listening. Every word from Duarte felt like a small hammer tapping against his chest. He didn't react, only looked at Lena. She was no longer looking down. She was watching him, her eyes filled with anxiety. When it was her turn, Sienna stepped up to the witness stand. Her voice was low but clear. "I was the first person to arrive after Mr. Cole pulled the child from the tracks. He did not call the press, did not request filming, and did not seek recognition. He simply ran, acting on the natural reflex of someone who couldn't stand idly by." Duarte laced his fingers together, giving a cold smile. "But subsequently, Mr. Cole retained the child without legal documentation. What is your opinion of a person who takes it upon himself to decide for the entire system?" Sienna looked directly at him. "I believe this system is sometimes too slow to save someone who desperately needs to be saved." A brief murmur swept through the gallery, then silence returned. When Sienna stepped down, Duarte called the next person. Second witness, Marta Cruz. Marta walked in, trembling, her coat damp from the rain. She avoided looking toward Ethan. Her voice was small, hoarse, as if worn by the wind. "Diego forced me to sign the papers. He said if I cooperated, I would get a share of the allowance from the court. I made a mistake. I didn't know they would harm the child." The room held its breath. Lena looked at Marta, not angry, just sad. She bit her lip, then gently lowered her head as if offering forgiveness without needing words. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in the hearing, he felt tears, not out of guilt, but because perhaps amidst all the adults talking about law, only a child truly understood sincerity. Duarte closed his file, stepping closer. "Mr. Cole, I have one final question. What do you have to prove your fitness to be a father?" Ethan stood up. All eyes turned toward him. He carried no documents, no lawyer beside him, just an old handkerchief in his jacket pocket, the last birthday gift his biological daughter had given him. "Nothing at all," he said softly, then looked at Lena. "I only know that for the first time in many years I wanted to come home, not because of work, but because someone was waiting for me." A wave of silence spread through the room. Even Duarte said nothing more. Only the rain outside tapped steadily on the window pane, punctuating the heavy breathing of everyone present. Judge Monroe looked down at the file and nodded faintly, her voice slow and distinct. "The hearing is temporarily adjourned. The court will issue its ruling after reviewing all evidence and testimony." The gavel struck the sound echoing in the room thick with the smell of wood and rain. Ethan bent down and took Lena's hand. They walked out through the waiting crowd of reporters. Flashbulbs flared relentlessly, illuminating the rain-drenched pathway. Two figures, one tall, one small, faded into the white sheet of rain amidst the distant metallic clatter of a train rolling through the city. The rain that night still hadn't let up. On the wet street outside the courthouse, Ethan held Lena's hand, walking slowly past the reporters who hadn't yet left. The final flash of light flared, then vanished. They got into the car, silent. The windshield wipers maintained a steady rhythm, merging with Lena's faint breathing in the back seat. As the car turned the corner, Ethan caught a reflection in the mirror, the familiar black car still trailing them a few hundred yards back. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, then sighed. "It's over," he told himself. "Let them talk. Let them write as long as the child remains safe." On the other side of the city, in a shabby motel by the highway, Diego sat on the old bed watching the morning news about the trial. The small screen was fuzzy, the announcer's voice steady. The hearing between Mr. Ethan Cole and Social Services has been temporarily postponed. Public opinion remains divided, but many are starting to question the veracity of the initial sources. Diego gave a cold laugh, picked up the glass of cheap liquor on the table, and violently smashed it against the wall. Glass shattered, the liquor staining a dark patch. "Back to being a hero, are we?" he growled, as if talking to himself. A knock sounded at the door. He turned his eyes, wary. The door creaked open, and Marta stood there, soaking wet coat, holding a thick envelope. She placed it on the table, her voice trembling. "This is the money he gave me. I can't keep it anymore," Diego sneered, sitting down and lighting a cigarette. "You think you can atone with cash?" Marta was silent, tears beginning to flow. "I used to be a good person, Diego. I was just too poor. You know that. You exploited it, made me do things I never thought I would." Diego turned away, his back hunched, his voice hoarse. "Don't blame me. I was just quicker on the draw than you." The silence stretched on. The light from the television reflected on his face amidst the cigarette smoke. The eyes that were once sharp as blades were now blurred. "Do you remember," Marta whispered, "the first day we met the girl she bowed to thank us even though she was hurt? You said, 'This kid will make us some money.' And me, I just wanted to hug her, but I didn't dare." Diego put out the cigarette, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain falling. The wind blew in, making the torn curtain flap wildly. "You should go, Marta. If you still have any kindness left, keep it before people take that too." Marta turned away, saying no more. The motel door closed, leaving Diego sitting alone amidst the smell of smoke and alcohol. In Denver, an internal message spread quickly through Cole Industries. He was asked to step down from the executive board. "Really, we have the official document." That afternoon, Ethan returned to the headquarters for the last time. The long hallway was quiet. The project commemorative photos hanging on the walls seemed no longer to belong to him. He signed his resignation, the pen moving slowly but decisively. No one tried to stop him. The news the next day: Ethan Cole officially departs Cole Industries. Just below that line, there was a smaller note: the Child Protection Center he founded continues operations. Employees assert he never truly left. That afternoon, Sienna stopped by. She looked at the pile of messy documents on his old desk. "No regrets." Ethan shook his head, his voice calm. "None. I only regret thinking money was a safe harbor. Then I realized it was just a house without doors." Sienna smiled faintly, then left an invitation: grand opening of the new center, the Hope Track, next week. That evening, Lena walked into the living room holding a large piece of paper. She spread it out in front of Ethan. The drawing showed a small house, its door open with two people sitting inside, one tall one, small, bathed in an orange light above. "I drew our house." Ethan looked at it for a long time. In the picture, the roof was slightly crooked, and the railroad tracks in front of the door stopped halfway. "Aren't you afraid people will talk again?" he asked. Lena looked up, smiling faintly. "They don't know. I used to have no home." Ethan didn't answer. He just reached out and gently stroked her hair, then folded the paper carefully as if guarding something more precious than his reputation. At the same time, at the suburban police station, Marta walked in. Her clothes were drenched, her face haggard. She placed a bag on the desk, her voice shaking. "I have evidence against Diego Vega. He sold photos and spread false information to the press. Here are the recordings and receipts." The officer looked at her and nodded. Marta sighed, as if shedding a burden she had carried for too long. The next morning, the police raided the motel. Diego was asleep, slumped in a chair. When handcuffed, he didn't resist. A reporter snapped a picture of him being led out the door, the rain still pouring down. He managed one hoarse sentence. He won. The escorting officer gave a dry reply. No, he just gets to live. A few days later, public opinion began to shift. One newspaper ran a simple yet brilliant headline, "Maybe kindness doesn't need a permit." People stopped throwing objects at Ethan's house. The wall was cleaned, the fence repainted. But he didn't return to the company, nor did he give any more interviews. Instead, every morning, Ethan opened the doors of the Hope Track, a small house converted from an old warehouse painted white with a blue wooden door. Inside, the sound of children's laughter echoed, sometimes drowning out the distant train whistle. Several months had passed since the day the public storm subsided. Now, the Hope Track was not just a protective center, but a small home for children who had experienced things no one should endure. Ethan and Sienna managed all activities together. She handled the paperwork and he oversaw the garden, the art class, and even the bedtime stories. Lena was different now. She smiled more, her eyes bright and clear. Every morning she put on her small backpack, said goodbye, and went to school. In the afternoon, she helped the younger children with drawing, told stories, and sometimes even taught them how to color the sky without rain. One afternoon, Sienna walked into the yard holding a cup of coffee, watching Ethan help Lena set up an easel. "Now you're officially working with kids, huh?" Ethan looked up, squinting at her. "I never thought I had the guts for it." "Oh, I think you just needed to learn patience." Sienna smiled. "Kids don't need someone perfect. They just need someone who won't walk away." Ethan chuckled softly. Amidst the sounds of laughter echoing around the yard, that statement sounded like a simple truth that had taken him half a lifetime to grasp. That afternoon, a government car pulled up outside the center. The person who stepped out was Roberto Duarte, still in a black suit, but his expression was different from the one he wore in court. No longer sharp, but possessing a sense of peace, almost relief. Ethan welcomed him into the small office. Duarte opened his briefcase, taking out a file marked with a red stamp. "The final ruling has been passed," he said. "Lena's legal guardianship is officially transferred to you." Ethan stood still for a few seconds, then nodded faintly. "Thank you, Roberto." Duarte closed the briefcase, adding slowly, "I still don't believe in inherent kindness, Mr. Cole. But perhaps today is an exception." As Duarte left, Sienna watched him go, saying half-jokingly, "Looks like you just made someone believe in the very thing they hated the most." Ethan replied, his voice deep, "Not me." It was the girl. Late afternoon, Lena ran over holding a brown envelope. "You got mail." Ethan opened it. It was Marta's shaky, weak but clear handwriting writing from a temporary detention facility. "I am sorry, not because I am afraid, but because I am ashamed. I hope one day to visit the center, not to atone, but to say thank you." Ethan read to the last line, then folded the letter and placed it on the desk. Lena looked at him, asking softly, "Is she a bad person?" "No," he replied, looking into the distance. "She was just lost." Sienna, standing at the door, heard this and smiled faintly. "That sounds like something a person who was once lost would say." Ethan shrugged, responding softly, "Maybe. But I was lucky enough to find my way, thanks to a little girl, smaller than her own backpack." Children's voices called from the yard, "Mr. Ethan." The train passed. "Come see." He and Sienna stepped out onto the porch. In the distance, the long train rolled along the old track, the steel wheels gleaming in the afternoon sun. Children cheered and waved as if greeting an old friend. Lena stood close beside him, her eyes following the train until it was just a trail of smoke far away. "I'm not scared anymore," she whispered. Ethan bent down, his gaze as gentle as on the first morning they met. Me neither. A boy about 8 years old pulled his hand, asking innocently, "Mister, why is the center called the Hope Track?" Ethan looked at the children, then at the old track still running along the back of the center. "Because some tracks aren't meant for trains to pass, but for people to stop," he said. "Sometimes stopping is the only way to survive." The children were quiet for a moment, then burst into laughter. A smaller girl shouted, "Then this place is our track." Sienna looked at Ethan, saying softly, "Looks like we did all right." Ethan nodded gently. "For the first time in my life, I think I truly came home." On the main wall of the center, a new picture frame hung. It was a photo taken many years ago, the moment Ethan carried Lena away from the tracks, the train lights shining brightly through the rain. Now, it had become the center's emblem of hope, of a different kind of beginning. Night was falling. Ethan turned off the office light, looking out the window. Spring snow fell lightly like mist, dusting the porch steps. Outside, under the yellow light, Lena was still awake, meticulously coloring her new drawing. Beside her, the old teddy bear sat, its stitched eyes worn, but the smile on the girl's face was whole. The Denver sky that morning looked freshly washed after a night of rain. The first light of day fell upon the windows of the Hope Track, glittering like small golden streaks painted on the pale blue walls. The wildflowers in the yard lifted their heads, and the scent of Sienna's baked goods filled the hallway. Ethan opened the window, welcoming the cold breeze mixed with the scent of grass. Laughter echoed from the yard. A few kids were playing train crossing the bridge with Lena, as the conductor shouting all aboard and waving the children through. He stood watching, his eyes shimmering with a peace he had thought lost forever. Sienna approached, holding a hot cup of coffee. "If someone had told me this scene last year, I would have laughed in their face," she said softly. Ethan smiled, his voice deep yet warm. "I wouldn't have believed it either. I used to think some wounds should be left alone, never treated. Now I see sometimes all you need is someone to come and sit beside you, and the wound closes itself." Sienna nodded. She looked toward Lena. The girl was showing her friends how to color the sun with orange crayon. Amidst the laughter, there was something truly pure, truly alive. At noon, as the children were having lunch, Ethan saw a man standing at the gate. He wore a long coat and a baseball cap, holding an old file bag. His eyes held a slight hesitation, like someone entering a place containing lost memories. "Excuse me, is this the Hope Track Center?" His voice was soft but shaky. Ethan nodded. "Yes, who are you looking for?" The man took off his hat and stepped inside, presenting an ID card. "I am Thomas Avery, Lena's mother's brother. I live in Nebraska. I read the news about your center, and I knew I had found the right place." The space fell silent. Ethan looked at him for a long time, then turned to the yard. Lena was eating her hair, tied up her face, flushed in the sunlight. Thomas continued, his voice hoarse. "I've been searching for her for years. After my sister passed away, the girl's stepfather left. I couldn't find the records, no leads. When I read the news about the incident last year, I knew immediately the child in the picture was my niece." Sienna stood nearby, her eyes initially scrutinizing, then softening. "You can come in and see her, but please be gentle. She is still sensitive." Thomas nodded slowly, following them inside. Lena looked up when she heard the footsteps. Sunlight poured through the window, brightening the small room. Thomas stood at the threshold, clutching his hat, his eyes damp. "You are Lena, right?" he asked. The girl nodded, tilting her head slightly as she looked at him. "You look so much like your mother," Thomas said, his voice catching. "When she was your age, she loved to draw too." Lena paused slightly. Ethan was about to step forward but stopped. He saw the girl's small hand placed on the table, her fingers tracing invisible lines on the wood surface. "You knew my mother?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas smiled faintly. "I'm your mother's older brother. I apologize for arriving so late." A moment of silence passed. Lena looked at him, then at Ethan, her eyes questioning. Ethan nodded very slowly, signaling that everything was fine. The girl walked closer to Thomas, hesitantly reaching out to touch the silver ring on his finger. "My mom wore one like this in the picture I kept." Thomas smiled, tears falling before he could wipe them away. Yes, they were our sibling rings. Your sister wore one. The other, I've kept it since she passed. No one spoke further. Lena walked forward and gently hugged him, the embrace of a child who had lost everything now touching a part of a deeply buried memory. That afternoon they sat in the garden. Thomas recounted old memories of the small house in Nebraska where summers were full of lavender, and Lena's mother used to teach the kids to paint on the back wall. Lena listened attentively, occasionally letting out a soft laugh when she heard stories about her mother. Ethan stood on the porch, watching the scene. A feeling both warm and bittersweet swelled in his heart. He knew that if this were before, he would be afraid of losing what he had protected all this time. But now he only felt grateful, because thanks to that man, Lena could touch a piece of the past that he could never replace. When twilight descended, Thomas came to say goodbye. I won't intrude any further, Denny. I just want to thank you for keeping the child alive and helping her learn to trust people again. Ethan shook his hand firmly. I didn't keep her, Thomas. I just opened the door. Whether she walked through it or not, that was her choice. Before leaving, Thomas left a small envelope. I'm returning to Nebraska, but my sister's house is still there. If Lena ever wants to, she always has a place to come home to. That night, Lena was awake. She stood outside Ethan's office door, Thomas's letter in her hand. Mister, she called softly. Ethan looked up from his desk, the light shining on a face with more noticeable lines now. Why aren't you sleeping? I'm afraid if I leave, you'll be alone again. Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. I was alone long enough. But this time is different. No matter where you go, this place will always be your home. And home never truly goes away, Lena. The girl walked closer and hugged him. I don't want to leave here. It's just, now I know somewhere out there someone still remembers my mother. I feel lighter now. Ethan stroked her hair. His voice choked, but warmed me too. I think we both found our missing pieces. A week later, Thomas left Denver. He left another handwritten letter. Thank you, Ethan. Not just for saving my niece, but for teaching me something I had forgotten. Being a parent isn't about biological connection. It's about having the courage to stand firm when the world walks away. Ethan folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden drawer next to the old teddy bear and Lena's first drawing, the unfinished railroad track in the field. He gently closed the drawer, a serene smile on his lips. On the day the center celebrated its first anniversary, the weather was exceptionally beautiful. Children ran across the yard hanging balloons and planting small flags along the fence. Sienna set out cookies and milk, adding a vase of wildflowers. When the ceremony began, Ethan stepped up onto the porch, his voice resonating amidst the cheerful chatter. A year ago, this place was just an old railroad track. Now it is home, and a home doesn't need walls. It just needs people who choose to stay. Everyone applauded. Lena ran up, handing him the new drawing she had made that morning. This is the last picture I'll draw here this season. The drawing depicted a train running through the sunset, but there was no endpoint visible ahead. On the roof of the train were happy children waving toward the bright orange sky. In the first carriage, a man and a little girl sat side by side looking forward. Ethan looked at the picture for a long time. Where is this train going? Lena smiled, her eyes shining in the sunlight. Somewhere people don't have to be afraid anymore. The answer made everyone silent. Sienna bowed her head slightly, concealing a smile. As for Ethan, he simply reached out and stroked the girl's head, the simple gesture he had made since that very first day by the tracks. Late evening, after everyone had left, Ethan turned off the lights, walking around the center one last time. On the walls, the children's drawings were still unfinished. Suns tracks, people, wildflowers, all small tales of hope. He stepped out onto the porch and sat down on the wooden steps. The night sky was clear, the moon shining brightly. In the corner of the yard, Lena was still awake, carefully repairing a torn drawing. Under the yellow light, the girl's face was radiant like her own inner light. On the drawing table, there was a small note. Mr. Ethan, I think everyone has their own track. But if you're lucky, that track will meet someone who knows to stop and pick you up. Ethan folded the note and placed it on his chest. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the lingering sound of children's laughter in the yard. Ethan quietly closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. And that is today's bedtime story. The tale is closed, but its echo surely still lingers in your heart, doesn't it? From the moment Ethan pulled Lena from the tracks years ago to the point where they built the Hope track together. What do you think about this conclusion? Which character moved you the most? Was it Ethan, the man who learned to open his heart after loss? Lena, the small but resilient girl? Or perhaps Sienna, who silently believed in the light she saw in others? And which action in the story stays with you? Was it the moment Ethan said, "I just opened the door," and whether she walked through it or not was her choice? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd truly love to know what part of this story touched your heart. I'll see you next time for our next bedtime story, where every journey begins with a small belief, but one strong enough to illuminate the entire night sky.